We're both armed.
Yes, armed and dangerous. All right, so if everyone has entered by now, so let us begin. Today I have the honor of introducing a man whom I consider not only one of the biggest intellectual influences on myself, but also, in my view, one of the most important libertarian philosophers and thinkers of the past half a century. And just like his father, Milton Friedman, before him, Дейвид Фридман, could rightly be considered one of the most important libertarian thinkers of the second part of the 20th and now the early 21st century. And his contributions to political and legal theory, specifically libertarian political and legal theory, could rival those, in my opinion, of any other libertarian thinker. And indeed, Professor Friedman himself could rightly be considered as one of the fathers of anarcho-capitalism, at least in its modern incarnation as a political theory, as he was one of the first to publish a modern book on the subject all the way back in the early 70s. And if I had to pinpoint one out of Professor Friedman's numerous intellectual contributions as, in my view, the most significant, I would say that it's probably his economic analysis of law and law enforcement, and his elaborate theory of how law and law enforcement could be produced on a free market basis. We libertarians tend to think that the market is better at producing all goods and services, better than the state at producing any good and service, with one major exception, which is precisely law and law enforcement. And Дейвид Фридман has basically devoted his entire life to proving this exception wrong and explaining how a completely market-based legal system can function in practice. And we're extremely lucky that the topic of his lecture today is precisely the economics of the market for law. So without any further delay, please give a loud round of applause for Дейвид Фридман.
Thank you. I'd like to start by talking about what I believe is a general problem with political argument which applies to socialists, libertarians, conservatives, progressives, and everybody else, and which I think is relevant to the arguments I'm going to be making tonight. And the general problem is that people put their argument in terms of the outcomes they want, not the institutions that will produce those outcomes. So they say, should government do X and Y? When what they should be asking is, if we give government the powers to do X and Y, how will they be used? For example, should we transfer from the rich to poor, is the way the argument is very often made, instead of asking, if the government has the power to redistribute income, what will actually happen? One of the things that will happen is the government will tax the rich to buy the support of the poor via welfare. Another thing that will happen is they will tax the poor to buy the support of the rich by having subsidized universities that the top half of the income distribution get into, by subsidizing luxury goods such as opera, and by providing well-paid jobs for college graduates funded by taxes paid by people, many of whom are not college graduates. Finally, if you have redistribution as an option, that changes everybody's incentives. It means that it pays you to spend time and money trying to make sure that you're receiving redistribution rather than giving redistribution. And that, what we refer to as rent-seeking, is a net deadweight loss on the system. It means that people are spending resources not on producing but on redistributing. For another example, should the government control global warming? There are lots of complicated questions about whether global warming is bad, how bad is it, what are ways of slowing it, what are their costs, what are their benefits. If you're sufficiently curious, I've discussed this issue on my blog off and on for 10 or 12 years. However, the question before that is, if we authorize government to do this, what will they actually do? And we have some evidence on that question. The biggest single thing the U.S. government has done in response to concerns about global warming is a biofuels program that currently converts more than 10% of the corn produced in the world into alcohol. It is fairly well established that doing this has no effect at all on global warming, that while you are not putting CO2 into the air from burning gasoline when you're burning alcohol, you are putting CO2 into the air when you run the tractors that grow the maize. And as far as I can tell, the current opinion of the people who are really worried about global warming is that there is no net gain. However, it does drive up the price of a major food crop. That benefits U.S. farmers, and it hurts the world's poor. And Al Gore, to his credit, publicly admitted that one of the reasons he came out in favor of biofuels was that at the time he was trying to get nominated for president, Iowa has one of the earliest primaries and is a farm state. All right? So if the question is not, are there things that a sufficiently wise and benevolent government could do to deal with global warming that would be worth doing? That's an interesting question, but it's not a relevant question because we have no such governments. The real question is, what will the actual incentives faced by political actors result in being done if you give government the authority to do it? Right. The same issue exists for arguments about what the law should be. Under present institutions, the question is not simply what law do we want, but what law can we expect to get? And the same question arises for libertarians. If a libertarian says, I want a constitutional republic whose constitution doesn't allow people to initiate coercion, that's very nice. That doesn't tell us what will actually happen when you establish such a set of institutions. And it's not very useful if we have no way of getting the libertarian laws libertarians want. We have a little bit of evidence due to an experiment that was started about 200 years ago. It took less than 130 years to get us from a constitution under which the federal government was only allowed to do those things that the Constitution specifically listed, to a court finding, a Supreme Court finding, that growing crops by a farmer that were fed to animals on his own farm counted as interstate commerce and therefore could be regulated under the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. All right? And that's, I think, an elegant example of the fact that you cannot really restrain governments from doing things that they want to do and that are politically popular to do. Right? So let's look a little at the current market for law. The market for law under current institutions. Law is purchased from the legislature. It is purchased by making campaign contributions to congressmen, by telling congressmen, our group of people will vote for you if you pass this law, by methods of that general sort. All right? Voters are rationally ignorant. Each voter knows that his vote has almost no chance of affecting the outcome of an election. Getting the information necessary to actually control the government by voting is costly. You have to pay a lot of attention to what your representative is doing and to what he should be doing. For some reason, congressmen never run as the bad guy. They never introduce a bill into Congress titled "A Bill to Make Farmers Richer and City Folks Poorer." Consequently, it is up to the individual voter to distinguish what the good guys from the bad guys, and there is no payoff to doing so. Consequently, most voters don't, rationally enough. The naive model of democracy doesn't work. But there's a more complicated model which looks at the economics of that market for law, and it says, consider an interest group that consists of a small number of organizations, maybe 4 auto companies and an auto union. For them to buy an auto tariff means that if one of them pays for the auto tariff, all of them benefit by it. It's what economists call a public good. But producing public goods is a lot easier for a small public. If you have only 4 organizations, it's reasonably easy for them to get together. And for Ford to say to General Motors, we will bribe these 3 politicians if you bribe those 4 politicians, and then we'll get the United Auto Workers to go persuade some other politicians that they can get contributions and votes. So the result is that the concentrated interest group can raise a sum to buy legislation that's a large fraction of the value of the legislation to them. The losers from an auto tariff are all consumers of autos and all producers of export goods, because when we import less, we export less. That's a highly dispersed interest group. It's a couple of 100 million people. Even if their loss is much larger than the gain to the auto companies, which it is, there is no way that they can compete effectively, that they can raise enough money to stop the auto tariff. This is a fairly well-established sort of public choice theorem, as it were. So the result is that we tend to get laws, such as tariffs, that make us worse off. So the problem for those libertarians who are not anarchists is, how would you keep the same thing from happening in your libertarian minarchy? All right? This then brings us to the alternative, which I'm going to be spending most of my talk discussing, and that alternative, of course, is anarcho-capitalism. Suppose we have a system where law is produced more or less the way food and cars are produced. We know the market works quite well for producing food and cars as private goods where you get what you pay for. What sorts of law, what will be the characteristics of the legal system that results from a private market for law? I assume there is probably at least one person in this room who has not read my book, The Machinery of Freedom, is not familiar with the institutions I proposed. So let me start by very briefly sketching the kind of anarcho-capitalist system I imagine. Each individual is the customer of a rights enforcement agency, and the rights enforcement agency is selling him the service of protecting his rights and settling his disputes. Then the problem which occurs to everybody from Ayn Rand on down is what happens when I, the customer of one rights enforcement agency, believes that this fine gentleman in the front row who is the customer of another rights enforcement agency stole my television, and he denies it. And my rights enforcement agency wants to come take the television back, and he says, in that case, I'll call my rights enforcement agency to protect me. Don't they end up fighting? And the answer is, it's very unlikely that they will end up fighting, because these are profit-making businesses, and warfare is expensive. Also, customers usually don't like having their front lawn turned into a free fire zone. So it is in the interest of both agencies to agree in advance to arbitration, to agree in advance to a private court whose verdicts they will accept. Right? Now, it may occur to you that they may make this agreement, but there's no government up there to enforce the agreement. All right, how do we enforce contracts without courts and the government? And the answer is that although there's no government, the agencies are repeat players. So each agency knows if my agency refuses to go along when I lose the case, then yours will refuse to go along when you lose the case. We're back to fighting each other, and our customers will leave for more prudent suppliers. So the basic argument that I'm sketching is that you have a system in which what determines the law is what rules it is in the interest of the of the arbitration agencies to make and the rights enforcement agencies to then buy. Right? What laws get produced under that system? Think about it as an economic system. The arbitration agency is selling its services to the rights enforcement agency. So it wants to produce laws and procedures that the rights enforcement agency will want to buy. It wants to be chosen by lots of rights enforcement agencies, lots of pairs of rights enforcement agencies, to be their court. The rights enforcement agency is selling a package to its customers, and one element of that package is what laws their customers will be under. More precisely, what laws their customers will be under in conflicts with that other agency. You will note that this is a polylegal system. It is possible that the rules between me and him and the rules between me and him are not the same. There's going to be some pressure for uniformity because it's easier to deal that way, but you probably won't get complete uniformity. Of course, modern systems you don't either. In the U.S., at least, laws vary some from state to state, for example. So the rights enforcement agency wants to buy from the arbitration agency a package of legal rules that its customers will like, in order that it can sell that along with its services, along with the police who show up when you call them and things like that, to its customers. And unlike a political system, the customer is now buying a private good. That means that the customer, since he has a choice of which rights enforcement agency to hire, it is in his interest not to be rationally ignorant. That just as when you're buying a car, if you decide to buy a Honda, you get a Honda. All right? If I decide to vote for Gary Johnson, I don't get Gary Johnson. I get Donald Trump. And if somebody else decided to vote for Hillary Clinton, he didn't get Hillary Clinton either. He got Donald Trump. All right? But when I decide to buy a car, that's the car I get. Consequently, it matters to me what I decide, so I have an incentive to try as best I can to be well informed. Furthermore, unlike the political case, I can actually observe the alternatives. That if you think about the problem of deciding whether Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton is better for America, we only get to see one of them. Even if you imagine that the next election Hillary wins, we then only get to see what Donald Trump was like under one set of circumstances and Hillary Clinton under another. But in the anarcho-capitalist system, I get to observe when my neighbor or my friend or my cousin calls the cops, how fast they show up. When he gets into a legal dispute, how complicated is it? How quickly is it resolved? Does it seem like a fair resolution, and so forth? So it's not certainly perfect, no system is, but relative to the political alternative, it is a system where it is in the rational interest of the people who ultimately control it, who are the customers, to actually make an informed decision about what to buy. All right? Rather like buying ordinary goods. But there is a qualification to this. It's not exactly like buying ordinary goods, because the law between me and him is the same as the law between him and me. So if I want one law and he wants a different law, we don't both get to have what we want. Unlike the case where if I want a Honda and he wants a Toyota, I get a Honda and he gets a Toyota. All right, so it's a slightly more complicated situation. It's one in which, rather than an ordinary straight market, in which it's a market which involves a whole lot of what economists would call bilateral monopoly bargaining, where the agencies are bargaining with each other on what rules they will agree with for their customers. If all the customers wanted the same rules, it would be easy. But I'm assuming there will be some diversity of taste among the customers, so there will be some cases where one firm's customers want the law one way and one firm's customers want the law another way. All right? So let's take an imaginary case of that sort. I'm going to assume that my firm's customers are in favor of the death penalty. They want to make sure that anybody who kills them will get executed in the hope that that will persuade people not to kill them. On the other hand, your firm's customers are against the death penalty, either because they think it's wicked, or because they're afraid the wrong person will be killed, or because they're planning to kill somebody and don't want to get executed, for whatever reason. All right? So in this case, each firm does some market research in order to find out how much its customers want to get their way. So each firm asks itself, if we could guarantee, my firm says, if we could guarantee to our customers that in conflicts with his firm's customers, the death penalty will apply for murder, how much more would our services be worth to our customers? His firm asks the same question with the alternatives reversed. How much more would their services be worth if they could guarantee that there would not be a death penalty in such cases? And once they've found out, whichever firm values it more buys it. That is to say, one firm can offer to pay the other for its agreement, or alternatively to let the other get its way on some other disputed issue. So they've got an incentive to try to bargain towards that set of rules that maximizes the sum benefit of their customers. I'm oversimplifying for a number of reasons, some of which I'll be explaining and some of which I won't, since I only have 45 minutes or so. But this is at least a roughly accurate description of what happens. So what's the outcome? The outcome is that you get that set of legal rules that maximize net benefit summed over everyone. And that is what economists refer to as an efficient outcome. Economically efficient outcome means that if you somehow were able to know how much every alternative outcome is worth to everybody, we pick the one where the sum total is largest. This is a concept due to Alfred Marshall, and he didn't call it economic efficiency, but that's what we call it now. Unfortunately, econ courses frequently put the argument in terms of a different definition due to Vilfredo Pareto, which I have long argued is a way of pretending you're not trading off benefits to different people when you really are. But that's a digression. If you want to read my price theory text, you can get the digression filled out. It's on the web for free. So the next question for us is, so that legal system is efficient, is it libertarian? All right, those aren't the same things. The answer is maybe. Libertarians believe that liberty works. All right, some people may say you should never violate rights whatever the cost. But oddly enough, all the people who say never initiate force whatever the cost also believe there's no cost. That is, also believe that the rule don't initiate force will in fact produce a very attractive world. I haven't yet found the libertarian who says you should never initiate force, and by the way, following that rule is going to result in a miserable society where everybody is poor and unhappy and ignorant. There are socialists who believe that that's the result, but they don't say you shouldn't initiate force. All right? So somehow people believe that liberty works, and I think on the whole they're right, that it is generally the case that the benefit to you of being able to violate my rights is less than the cost to me, that the benefit to you of stealing $100 from me is $100 minus the time and trouble it takes you to do it. The cost to me is $100 plus the time and trouble I spend trying to stop you from doing it. Pretty clearly, the second number is larger than the first. So therefore, in bargaining for rights, my agency is going to value having its customers not be subject to theft or robbery more than an agency which has got some robbers as its customer will value it the other way. All right? So insofar as liberty works, insofar as the kind of society you want is a more attractive one to live in, we would expect that rights-respecting laws are themselves efficient, and therefore we would normally expect that if we make an economically efficient set of laws, which is what I'm claiming my system generates, they will also be libertarian laws. But there could be exceptions. All right? You could imagine a society where practically everybody passionately believes that using heroin is just horrible. Or if you don't like using heroin, that homosexual sex is just horrible. Or something else. And if enough people strongly enough believe it, they will value getting laws that prevent that thing at more than the victims, the people who use heroin or who engage in homosexual sex, value getting their way, and in that case you would have an unlibertarian law in an anarcho-capitalist society. I have long argued that anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism are not the same thing by definition. The claim that an anarcho-capitalist society will be libertarian is a theorem to be proved, not something you can just get by definition. All right? You could end up with unjust laws. However, you will note that under those circumstances, the current system will also produce such laws. Indeed, it did. All right? So therefore, my claim is that we can expect the private market for law to produce laws more libertarian than alternative institutions such as democratically elected legislatures would produce, but not perfectly libertarian. Now, you could imagine a minarchist libertarian, somebody who believes in a minimal state which has rules that never violate rights. He could say, look, my minarchy has a rule against violating rights, so it's better than your anarchy. But of course, that gets us back to where I started. The question is not, do you define your minarchy as as a system that never defines rights? It's when you set it that never violates rights. It's when you set that up, will it violate rights? It isn't sufficient for the minarchist to say, well, if it starts violating rights, now it's not the minarchy I'm arguing for. Fine, but that doesn't make people whose rights are violated any better off. All right, so that go back to my point at the beginning, the question is not what outcome are you arguing for, but what institutions can you propose that will get the outcome you're arguing for. And as I've just suggested, the institutions of a stateless society, of an anarcho-capitalist society, are going to get closer to the outcome that libertarians want than the institutions of some sort of a democratic political system along our current lines. All right? So argument by definition doesn't really do any good. All right? I now want to talk about some problems with my analysis. Some of the things maybe you shouldn't have believed, or at least some of the things that I left out. And they're mostly things that I left out when I wrote the first edition of the book, but have put in the additional 100 pages of the third edition. So there are basically two significant problems with my analysis that I wanted to talk about. The first is what I think of as market failure on the market for law. That if you think through the economics of markets, you discover that while markets usually produce economically efficient results, there are some situations where they won't. And economists use terms like externality and public good problem and adverse selection to explain them. But ultimately, all of these involve situations where the person who is making a choice does not bear the net cost of that choice. So you have a situation where I am choosing to burn coal in my fireplace in London in the 19th century. One of the costs of that is a thick London fog. Most of that cost is borne by other people, not by me. So it might pay me to burn the coal, even if the total cost is larger than the total benefit. That's an inefficient outcome. Standard economics. Some libertarians want to pretend that it's wrong, but they're mistaken. It turns out that while a laissez-faire system is probably better than any alternative, it is not as good as what you would get if you had a God up above who was benevolent and omniscient and all-powerful and could make us always do the right thing. We have a shortage of such gods, as it happens. So I want to claim that the same problem is going to exist on my market for law, that there are going to be cases in the market for law where for the same reason it doesn't produce the efficient outcome. The second thing I left out is when I talked about two agencies bargaining over the death penalty, I never said which one had to pay to get its way. What's the default? All right? Implicitly in the story, it sounded as though if we don't agree, there will be a death penalty, or if we don't agree, there won't be a death penalty. But as though there is some situation that one of us has to make an offer in order to get away from. Where does that come from? Which agency has to pay the other to get its way, and why does that matter? So those are the two issues that I want to spend really the rest of this talk discussing. Market failure on the market for law, and the implications of the distributional problem of the issue of when you get the law you want, who has to pay for it, which side has to pay for it. Let me start with market failure on the market for law. And what I'm considering is a law which defines the rule between A and B, but has sizable effects on C. So we will imagine that I'm the customer of one rights enforcement agency, this pleasant gentleman in the front seat is the customer of another rights enforcement agency, and the gentleman next to him is the customer of a third rights enforcement agency. And my agency goes to his agency and says, you know, I think you ought to agree to respect copyright law. You ought to agree that if you want to read Professor Fridman's books, you have to be willing to pay. You have to be willing, in effect, to pay him for the right to read them. That you can't just make copies for free or get them off the internet or whatever. And question is, why should he agree to that? Why should his agency agree to that? And the benefit to me of his agreeing to that is that I get royalties. I get money paid for the use of my intellectual property. The cost to him is that he pays royalties. That looks like a wash. But he also gets another benefit, which is that I write more books because I'm now being paid for writing them. But we also have some other costs that in order to enforce that rule, we've got to take various actions to make sure he's not secretly copying my books. Once in a while, I've got to sue him when I discover he has, and so forth. So it may well turn out that including all of those costs, between the two of us, it's not worth having copyright law. That between the two of us, the benefit to me is less than the cost to him. All right? What about him? Well, if we do have copyright law, I write more books, he gets to read them, and since his rights enforcement agency, the SOBs, have not agreed to respect my copyright, he gets to read them for free. All right? So that means that the total benefit of agreeing to copyright law is larger than the net benefit between the two agencies doing the bargaining. That there is an external benefit to customers of a third agency which is going to get ignored. So it is entirely possible that even if copyright law is on net a good thing, we won't get it. All right? So that's one example of the problem of market failure on the market for law. All right? So we might decide not to agree on copyright law even if doing so would produce a net benefit. I should say I'm taking no actual position on whether copyright law is a good or bad thing. My point is that it could be a good thing, and even if it's a good thing, we may not get it in my system. And that's only one example. Another fairly obvious example would be laws regulating pollution. Think of it as tort law. Suppose we say that if I put stuff in the air that makes it unpleasant for him to breathe, he can sue me and collect damages. All right, that's a view that many libertarians would endorse, maybe not all of them. However, the benefit of that is that there's less pollution. The cost of that to him is that he doesn't get to run his chemical factory or whatever he's doing, or he can only run it if he pays. And then again, there are additional costs of enforcing this agreement, of monitoring the air, figuring out who's responsible for problems, suing each other, and so forth. As in the previous case, agreeing that he can sue me for my air pollution benefits the customers of other agencies which weren't in the negotiation, because the result of that is that I pollute less, and therefore their air is cleaner. So we again have a case where the incentive to pass the law underestimates the actual benefit of the law, and therefore you may fail to get it even if it's worth getting. So more generally, whenever the legal rule between customers of two agencies has large effects on customers of other agencies, those effects get ignored in the initial bargaining, which can lead to an inefficient legal rule. Now, again, I'm oversimplifying because you could imagine bargaining involving three agencies. But if you imagine a system with 100 agencies, it's going to be very hard to get them all in, because any one agency that says, well, I'm not going to agree to copyright law or I'm not going to agree to pollution law is getting a benefit at the expense of the others. He's free riding. So that was the first thing that I wanted to add to my analysis to show that I oversimplified. That while there is a tendency for my system to give efficient law, there are describable circumstances in which it will fail to do so. There are some other more complicated ones that I'm ignoring. But it's really only a first approximation. And I should say the same thing is true of markets in general. That one of the talks that I'm not giving here, but that I've given elsewhere, is my talk on market failure as an argument both for and against government. That market failure, which is the situation where individual irrational behavior is not group rational, occasionally exists on the private market. So the private market does a less than perfect job, but it is very much more common on the political market, where people very rarely bear the costs of their actions. Hence, shifting decisions from the private market to the political market usually makes us worse off, not better off. That's a different talk, and I don't have an extra 45 minutes to give it here, but if you're really interested, I'm sure there's a video of it somewhere on my webpage. So I now want to go on to a different thing which I didn't consider, and that's what I think of as the distinction between allocation and distribution. That my argument earlier showed that we would or wouldn't get the death penalty according to whether it was allocationally efficient, whether on net people were better off as a result. So my argument showed that two agencies will bargain to legal rules that maximize the net benefit to their customers. But I said nothing about which agency has to pay for agreement. Machinery of Freedom, when it was published, only got one good review, and that review was by Jim Buchanan. And in his review, I should say, a good review means a review that makes the author of the book think. That's my definition. And he gave me that review, I suppose, about 40 years ago. And only took me about 35 years to write another chapter for Machinery of Freedom in which I tried to respond to that point. Because he was right. It was a real issue that I had not thought about. So I want to think a little bit about what I think of as the threat game. All right? Imagine we're back again in the case where the agencies are bargaining over the rules. And if the agencies can't agree on a court, they end up in violent conflict. And violent conflict is a bad thing. But it's a worse thing for the agency that's less good at violence. All right? If your agency has tanks and mine only has soldiers, then a lot more of my people get killed than yours get killed when we have a violent conflict. And that suggests that there's going to be at least some tendency for the stronger agency to agree to the efficient rules but collect a side payment for doing so. So if we imagine a situation where, on the whole, my threat to not agree and fight it out is more believable than your threat, then if you want the law your way, you probably have to make a side payment to me. And if I want the law my way, I just have to refuse your offer of a side payment because it's not enough. All right? So why does this matter? The reason it matters is that one of the potential weaknesses to anarcho-capitalism is instability against cartelization of rights enforcement agencies. All right? If we end up with only a very small number of rights enforcement agencies, they might decide that robbery pays better than production, in which case they get together to reinvent government and taxes, with them as the government. All right? How likely that is depends on how many agencies there are. For those of you who have an economics background, forming a cartel is much easier if there are only 2 or 3 or 4 firms in an industry than if there are 100 firms in the industry. So that means that we care, in thinking about how well anarcho-capitalism will work, on how many rights enforcement agencies there will be. All right? Well, as an economist could tell you, that's really a question of economies of scale. In any industry at all, there are advantages and disadvantages to a firm being big. All right? A big firm can take advantages of things like the economy of scale, of writing up instructions for its product once and then making 100,000 copies. All right? On the other hand, the bigger a firm gets, the more layers of administration there are between the president and the factory floor. And that results in inefficiencies, in costs due to the fact that you have to hire lots of people to watch people who are watching people who are watching people who are watching people who are actually doing something, and sometimes the people who are doing something aren't doing what the people at the top want them to. So there are economies and diseconomies of scale, which is why it is quite unusual to have natural monopoly. Not that it never happens, but that typically by the time a firm is big enough to produce for the entire market, it's big enough so that a smaller firm can eat its lunch, so that a smaller firm can produce better services cheaper. So now let's apply this analysis to the case of firms that are producing rights protection. The question is, at what size do the disadvantages of size start outweighing the advantages? And for rights enforcement, the answer is probably not a very large size. We don't really know. This industry doesn't exist in the form I'm describing. But there are some parallel businesses that police departments are doing roughly this sort of thing. Private guard agencies are doing roughly this sort of thing. And arbitration agencies are doing some of this stuff. We don't actually observe that New York City gets really good policing really cheap, which is what you would expect if there were large economies of scale in that kind of business. So it seems plausible, though by no means certain, that the economies of scale in rights enforcement only go up to the point where the present area of the United States would have 100 or 200 or 300 rights enforcement agencies, not where we'd have 2 or 3. That sounds optimistic. That's the argument I made 40-some years ago in the first edition of Machinery. But the problem is that even if a larger firm isn't better at producing right protection, it might be better at threatening other firms. It's got more tanks in its basement. All right? So if that's right, you might get a source of economies of scale coming not from the ability to produce, but from the advantages in bargaining with other firms. The more economies of scale you have, the fewer firms there are and the less stable the system is. So that's why the point that Jim Buchanan made is a legitimate critique. It implies a weakness in my system that I had not been aware of. On the other hand, once such a system is well established, there's a lot of force to the status quo. That if you think about ordinary bargaining, it's the usual pattern is that people will resist changes in what you've agreed to a lot more harder than they will push for changes. So if a firm says, well, it used to be that we agreed to no capital punishment, but we've decided it's worth more to us, and we want capital punishment unless you pay us some more to stop, that's probably going to look like cheating. It's probably going to look like, all right, we've got this agreement. This is what we've done before. If you want to change it, you pay us. Right? So it seems likely that what you're going to end up with is that the problem I described is a fairly serious problem when the system is getting started. But once the system's been running for a while, there is a default outcome. The default outcome is keep doing what you've been doing. And that's usually the default outcome when people are bargaining with each other. And if you want to change, you've got to pay for it to make it in my interest. So the conclusion that I'm arguing for, a couple of related conclusions, is that anarcho-capitalism will tend to produce economically efficient law, which will tend to be libertarian law, but both of those are only approximations, that there will be exceptions in both cases. On the other hand, that we have better reason to expect both of those than with any other institutions that are producing law. That the same sort of things that cause problems with anarcho-capitalism are likely to cause larger problems with democratic legislative making of laws and similar systems. All right? A further conclusion is that anarcho-capitalism may, under some circumstances, be unstable against coalitions to recreate government, but that will be mostly a problem at the beginning, and if one can get the system functioning and established, you would, at least if you've got a reasonably large area it's operating over, expect a fairly substantial number of rights enforcement agencies. All right, that's what I wanted to say. If you want more information on this, the third edition of The Machinery of Freedom has 100 pages in the second edition, roughly. And some of them deal with this. Some of them deal with other new material, and some of them deal with thinking through more carefully old material, and something is collapsing around us, but I don't know what. But in any case, Machinery of Freedom second edition you can get for free from my webpage. Machinery of Freedom third edition is available from Amazon. It's available as...
Continue.
It's available. I don't really need this. I have a loud voice. It's available as a Kindle, which I think costs $2.99, which I guess is roughly 2 of your units, a little over 2 of your units. And it's available as a printed book, which costs more than that, but not a huge amount more. And the one really nice thing about the printed book is that it's got the best cover I've ever gotten for this, as you will see. A cover that I got by setting up a contest on my blog and having readers who happen to be artists compete to submit covers. Really pretty cover. Go look at it. Also, if you look at my webpage, you can find lots and lots of stuff. I've got the full text of, I suppose, 4 or 5 of my books, many, many different articles, both academic and libertarian, 300 medieval recipes, roughly, because my wife and I like cooking from very old cookbooks, a certain amount of poetry, a bunch of other stuff. So that's the information for my webpage. The webpage has a link to my blog, and on my blog you can find what I think about global warming and home unschooling and a whole bunch of other things. Thank you.
we're not. Okay, perfect. So now we'll have the questions by the number. So first is there, second there, third, who would have had, so.
David, great to meet you finally in Sofia. I have a question about the market of, my question is about the benefits of dictatorship in the markets of laws. And the general, reasoning, for that question is that markets are typically international. And similar to your example with the biofuels, we have a case in the European Parliament which is basically trying to eliminate one of the components of biodiesel, the palm oil, from the production of biodiesel. So the motion was promoted by the European Parliament, by the coalition of United European Left, Nordic Left Greens, and the Communist Party of Bohemia and Slovakia, and Moravia. So the idea of the parliamentary motion is to stop using palm oil into the biodiesel,
Yes.
which basically is argumented with the ideology of the climate change and the rainforest. Mm-hmm. So the motion is violating 4 of the 5 WTO principles. So what is likely to happen is that the actual legislative body, which is not exactly elected, but is somewhat elected, the European Council, will basically do nothing to implement this motion, or will procrastinate over time. So which is basically a case of dictatorship into the international market of laws. So is there a benefit of the dictatorship in the market of laws?
I don't think I understand what your question has to do with. That in terms of dictatorship in general, if you happen to have a good dictator, there's much to be said for dictatorship, but the problem is that it's very hard to guarantee a good dictator. For anybody who's actually interested in that subject, there's a historical novel that I'm rather fond of by Mary Renault called The Praise Singer, which is set in ancient Greece, and it involves a portrait of 3 different tyrannies. In ancient Greece, tyrant was not a negative term. A tyrant was basically a popular dictator. And the novel describes one tyrant who was corrupt but competent. And in order for him to be rich and live a luxurious lifestyle, his island had to do well. So he was a pretty unpleasant person, but when he died, things went to hell. Then there's the second tyrant who was actually competent and benevolent, and things went very well, and he died. And his kids took over, and for a little while, things kept going, and then they slid downhill. So that's sort of an interesting portrait of the potential for dictatorship to do well if you are very lucky in your dictator, but it is not something you can count on.
So, Professor Fridman, I would like to ask you something that bothers my anarcho-capitalistic mind for over a year now. So I would like to address the connection between antimicrobial resistance and property rights. Basically, what's the problem? In the past 50 years, the innovation pipeline for new antibiotics is pretty dry. This is simply because on the cost side, pharmaceutical firm has to invest around $1 billion for the development of new antibiotic. And on the revenue side, they can expect monopoly for around 5 years after the FDA approves the drug. And usually consumers take the antibiotic for only a week, and obviously it's not sufficient to cover their expenditures for research and development. My question is the following: if there is no patent protection for prolonged time, giving them legal monopoly, how will this work in the anarcho-capitalistic state of law? Wouldn't die millions of people before the price increases sufficiently in order for somebody to develop this new drug that is needed?
Yeah, for the reasons that I just described in the case of copyright, you would expect a less than optimal patent protection under the anarcho-capitalist system. On the other hand, we currently have an enormously more than optimal restriction on the introduction of new medical drugs. So the answer, I think, is that you would, on the one hand, not have as long protection, may not have any protection at all, depending what they bargain to. But on the other hand, you will not have that billion-dollar cost, because a very large fraction of that billion-dollar cost is the cost of satisfying the FDA. And one piece of evidence on this subject is an old piece by Sam Peltzman, a fairly prominent economist who did statistical work, in which he tried to estimate the effect of one change in the FDA rules. This was a amendment to the Pure Food and Drug Act, which required that in order to introduce a drug, you had to show not only that it was safe, but that it was an improvement over what was already there. And doing that raised the cost, obviously, of introducing the drugs. The argument was that drug companies were bringing in new drugs that really were no benefit. People just didn't know that. And Peltzman tried to estimate what the effect of that change was on the average quality of drugs and on the rate at which drugs were introduced. And his conclusion was that it had no effect at all that you could observe on the average quality, and it cut the rate at which new drugs were introduced roughly in half. So that's only one part of the regulation. So that at least suggests that the scale of the negative effect of the present system is probably larger than of the positive effect. And of course, the positive effect is very complicated, because the positive effect on the one hand gives an incentive to introduce new drugs, but it also makes new drugs, once introduced, very expensive. But the general answer is that there are lots of cases in which there's something a government could do that would make us better off. The argument for the anarchist position is that on average the things governments do make us worse off. So it is certainly possible that there are it's surely possible there are restrictions that could exist on drugs that would make us better off. It is even possible there are restrictions that do exist on drugs that make us better off. But we know that there are restrictions on drugs that make us a great deal worse off. And in lots of other areas, we know that the total, if you think about going back to my example of biofuels, of turning maize into alcohol, that's a whopping big amount of damage for anybody to do, taking off the market something like 10 or 15% of the production of one of the major food crops. So yeah, sure, it's possible. I've never argued either with regard to laissez-faire within a government system or with regard to anarcho-capitalism, that it is always in every way better. All I'm arguing in both cases is that the alternative is government with its good and bad things, no government with its good and bad things, and that given those alternatives, you're better off with no government.
Hi, I have a question about I'm over here.
Sorry, where is it? I'd like
way
to
in the
see
back.
you. Aha, thank you.
My question is about the anarcho-capitalism versus minarchism debate.
Yes.
You didn't really address this point, and this is something that makes me think that actually the debate might even be unnecessary. I used to call myself anarcho-capitalist, and I still call myself that in some circles like this one. But I'm not really sure. I mean, are we arguing about whether we're teleporting ourselves into one of the two states tomorrow? Because that's obviously unrealistic. It's also not realistic that we are forming a brand new society on a new planet. So what realistically happens is that we gradually push and transition to less and less government interference. And if we start arguing about anarcho-capitalism versus minarchism today, what are we saying? So when the time comes that we have eliminated all unnecessary government interference and we're only left with the courts and the military and whatever, should we push even further or should we stop then? But we don't know yet. I mean, it's one of the early lectures about Liechtenstein, so they hardly have any crime problem, for example. So this might not even be a necessary debate, and it seems like we're just arguing about problems that we don't even know that will exist when the time comes to solve them. So just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I guess my answer would be that I agree that we are not likely to have to make that decision anytime in the next year or two. On the other hand, it's worth thinking through your beliefs. And if you say to somebody, the reason we ought to have laissez-faire in drugs is that government initiation of coercion is wicked, one argument. Or if the reason you say is because government initiation of coercion makes us worse off, it's a legitimate response to someone to say, for someone on the other side to say, but wait a minute, you're in favor of having taxes to run the police and the courts, so how can you make this general claim about other forms of government interference? And therefore, it is worth thinking through the question of how far you can carry the principles, whether they're moral principles or practical arguments that you're arguing for. And I think if you look at the history of socialism, which was a very successful ideology in the 20th century, that one of the things that strengthened them was that although their policy proposals were Fabian, that is, were for gradual changes, their rhetoric was utopian, and that you could inspire people by saying, we aren't going to be there tomorrow, but this is the system we eventually want to have. And similarly, it seems to me that for us, if we can say, not only are we better off getting rid of this government activity and that government activity, but look, if you really think about it, we could be better off getting rid of all government activities, that makes the ideology that we are, as it were, selling a more interesting and more attractive ideology. So that would be my answer to you. Another question?
Sorry. Does it work?
Check out the bottom if it's red.
No, yeah, it's red. Okay. So it's quite in connection with the previous question, but I think that we won't be able to do it gradually, as the guy suggested. So have you thought about how do we do the revolution and how do we bootstrap that system?
Yeah. On the whole, I think revolutions are probably a mistake. There may be exceptions, but as a general rule, I think a lot of the support for government comes from people worrying about violence. And a revolution makes them worry more about violence, and therefore is likely to make them tolerate an even worse government. So from that standpoint, I think that as a rule, revolution is a mistake. I think that there are a number of different strategies that can move us gradually towards what we want. One of them is to develop what's essentially anarcho-capitalism online in cyberspace. I've got an old article on my webpage called A World of Strong Privacy, in which I describe how, taking advantage of public key encryption, you could create an online world which is invisible to governments, in which transactions between me and anybody else, including a stranger, can only be seen by the intended recipient, in which business payments are invisible, in which communication can't be traced. I go through a lot of detail on that. And that might give you a world where we had anarcho-capitalism online, government still run real space. If enough of our life is online, that's getting us pretty far. And furthermore, not only can we have a lot of our life online, but the more of our life is online, the more mobile we are. The easier it is to move. And the more mobile we are, the more governments are reduced to the status of landlords. That if you really have a situation where all the government can control is whether it lets you live there, well, then governments are going to compete to rent out their land, in effect. So in that sense, mobility is a good thing. I was struck by this most recently, I guess a few years ago, when I and my adult daughter were traveling in India, and she was conducting her business as a online freelance editor as we traveled, because it didn't matter where she was as long as she had an internet connection. And I can argue with the same people, which is one of my forms of entertainment, as long as I have an internet connection.
Thank you for your presentation, sir. So my question is about the nature of the rights enforcement agency which you proposed. So at one point historically we decided to split state power into the legislative, the executive and the judicial. And it would seem to me that the agencies which you propose actually concentrate the legislative and the executive. So do you believe that a further split in there will happen? And also, do you think that these arbitration these arbitration courts will at one point follow precedent, or will they prefer sort of the European style of justice?
That is, to begin with, the institutions I'm describing do separate. They separate legislation and executive activity. That is, the rights enforcement agencies are the executive agency, as it were, and the arbitration agencies are doing both legislation and judicial. They're combining it. You could imagine further division. It might be there would be firms that specialized in producing law codes, and that then the arbitration agencies, rather than writing their own law code, would say, all right, which is the law code you people would like us to use? We'll use that one. So in general, in arguing for having done things on the market, I don't have to know how they will be done. That I can argue that we are better off having automobiles built by competitive firms than built by governments without knowing how to build an automobile. And similarly, I can see some advantages to precedent and some disadvantages to precedent, and I don't think I can predict which one the arbitration agencies would decide was the best product to produce. That's going to be a market decision made by people who know much more, who in that future will know much more about it than I do, and whose living will depend on their making it right, as mine does not.
A round of applause for Dr. Fridmans.